Well, hello there, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and this is our latest installment of Talking Democracy, our occasional Zoom series, and I'm very delighted to be joined today by Anthony Foxx. Secretary Foxx was President Obama's second transportation secretary uh, in the later years of his term, in the second term, and he's written an article for the Journal that we posted on the website last week. I want to talk to him about that and various other things. Secretary Foxx, hi.
How you doing? Good to see you, Michael.
I'm okay. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And thanks for writing this article. It was really timely and it was really interesting. And I want you to tell folks about it. I'll just start by reading the headline and the deck, as we call it, subheadline that we put on it. And you can explain to people what that means and what your argument was. We called it, "It's time for transportation equity. Just as there has been redlining in housing, so does our physical infrastructure reveal a legacy of discrimination. It's time to eliminate it." It's all yours.
Yeah, well, I had an opportunity as not only transportation secretary, but even prior to that, as mayor of the city of Charlotte, to see our infrastructure from a different perspective. And frankly, some of what I write about is part of my life experience, but a lot of it is observational. As I traveled around the country as transportation secretary to all 50 states and many parts of the world, in almost every American city I went, there would be a community that would talk about, some highway project or airport project or rail project that had bifurcated the neighborhood, and the people felt that they never had an opportunity to be heard. And that extends to Rondo up in Minneapolis, to Claiborne Expressway down in New Orleans, I-10 in Los Angeles, I-5 in Seattle. It's a process and systemic relic of the era of the highway build, and also of other parts of our history. The way I would put it is, at the same time that President Eisenhower was sending troops into Little Rock to help children go to high school, the federal government was arming those very states with the ability to use massive amounts of government power and money to put in these systems. And so what I talk about in the paper is not just problem definition, but also some ideas that could be incorporated either in the current discussions of infrastructure or future discussions of infrastructure as to how to actually attack those relics and to bring us together as a country.
Yeah. One interesting point in the piece that was kind of news to me, actually, and I used to feel I knew a fair amount about this topic, was the great leeway and freedom that states have in determining where their highways go and what little role the federal government really plays in that. Can you expand on that for folks?
Yeah, the original contract with the federal government and states back in the 1950s was the federal government was putting up the capital cost of building the interstate system. Upwards of 92% of the dollars that went in to build it originally were federal dollars. But then the states were duty bound to maintain it. And as part of that, the states were also responsible for designing the systems. Mm-hmm. And that gave enormous power to state governments, again, at a time when our country was struggling with inclusiveness, particularly of African-American communities.
Yeah, so you named a couple of examples at the top, Minneapolis and New Orleans, but I mean, this is all over the country, really, isn't it?
Yeah, no part of the country was exempt. I mean, even, my friends up in New York, the Bronx-Queens Expressway is written about in the Power Broker, a book by Robert Caro, where a 1 mile stretch of the freeway they went out of the way to destroy a neighborhood because of a particular attitude towards that neighborhood. So there are examples all around our country, and really, when I go out and talk to communities, they know it. And by the way, I'm glad to see the current administration talking about this now, because we know that there are problems with housing and education and disparities in health. but now transportation is starting to take on more urgency on the same front.
Yeah. Let me ask you now about your years as mayor of Charlotte, because I know that your tenure was generally well regarded there, and I rode your little light rail line when I was down there for the Democratic convention. Talk about some of the things you did there, which to some people would be kind of like an unlikely place for these kinds of innovations to happen.
Yeah, well, I first of all, I took office right in the depths of the Great Recession, and one of the things that we did was we tried to use transportation as a way, kind of a Keynesian economic way of trying to get people back to work and to re-inject in our city more economic growth. And so we extended that light rail line from the center city up to the university system. We put in a streetcar, which is still very controversial, but it was designed to not only provide a transportation facility in the east and western parts of the city, which were highly underserved for decades, but also an economic catalyst for those areas. And I spent a lot of time studying how to reinvent areas because 3/4 of my city was underperforming when it came to ad valorem values. And we tried everything. We put police substations in areas. We put efforts in public-private efforts into schools. We rezoned areas. We put business parks in areas. But transportation is also part of the mix that helps bring places back and generates recovery. And we're now seeing that in those areas where we put that particular project.
Yeah. And now talk a bit about your tenure as transportation secretary. You write in the piece that you oversaw some innovations to try to address past racial inequity in transportation policy and design. So just tell folks about that for a bit, please.
Well, the first thing to say is that the department can only perform things that it has the authority to do. And so we were working within what you might call executive authority. And one of the opportunities today is to expand executive authority to enable the agency to do more. But at the time, what we did was we tried everything. First of all, we incorporated equity considerations into discretionary grant programs. And that is extended to everything to what's now called the INFRA program, to the Smart City Challenge that we did. And we got some very, very, I believe, important work done to put that in the minds of project planners to think about equity as they were seeking federal funds. And we were able to award lots of dollars to these types of projects. And they were, by the way, in urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas. We were also able to do charrette exercises with groups like the Urban Land Institute, to look at some of the past projects that had destroyed some communities or made communities more difficult. And some of those designs are actually starting to get implemented today. And so when I go around the country, the 18 bridges in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, that we were able to do, the CAP in Pittsburgh, and I think about the Smart City Challenge in particular, I think we have some good evidence that this work can be done.
Yeah. You write toward the end of the piece, you list a series of recommendations. I think it was 8 recommendations that you make for transportation policy and planning going forward. The most intriguing of which I thought was that you called for something that you call a chief national planner, like the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, with a term of 10 years and a board just like the Federal Reserve. Tell folks what that would do, what that would accomplish for transportation policy.
Sure. Most areas have something called a planning commission, and part of what a good planning commission does is they take into account economic data. They take into account mobility data. They try to help create more of a synthesis of what kinds of needs are emergent and how dollars and policy should line up to address that. And so the country doesn't have that, though. What we have as a country is 11 mega regions across the United States that are economically tied together. Many of them are multi-state, and most of them don't do joint planning. And as a result, we're lucky when projects happen that actually enable us to grow more jobs and to create better quality of life and take into account some of the things like equity. But we're lucky. We're not necessarily doing it in the best, most methodical way. So I think of this as like a plenary type of group that offers opinions. It doesn't necessarily have the power to implement them, but it provides us an opportunity to hear a group that is non-political help us focus on how to best use our transportation dollars and frankly, maybe even some of our economic development dollars.
That's a really interesting idea. I want to move to the current transportation bill here in a moment, but first I want to ask you, with respect to questions of racial equity, the president, as you know, pledged that, trying to pursue policies of racial equity throughout the executive branch and therefore throughout all of federal policy would be one of his 4 key goals when he came in. Are you up on this? Have you seen evidence of that happening in the transportation realm yet?
Well, I think it's early.
Yeah.
They're in the first months of the new administration, and I know that there are several things that are ongoing, including the push in the jobs plan for a dedicated program to equity. I also know that there are active Title VI investigations occurring on projects that are controversial across the country. So we'll have to see how it plays out, but I'm hopeful, and I frankly think that putting the yardstick out there early puts some good constructive pressure on the administration to continue keeping this issue top of mind.
So let's talk about this bill. Passed the Senate with shocking levels of bipartisan support. I don't think there's any other way to say it. And hung up a little bit in the House politically, but anyway, let's talk about the substance of it. What do you think that's good about the bill?
Well, I think what's good about the bill is that it injects a significant amount of money into a system that's been starving for it for quite some time. We've gotten to a place in this country where a 10-mile project gets sliced up into 2-mile segments, and we're building 2 miles at a time when it's actually cheaper to build the 10 miles in the first place. So putting the kind of capital in place that allows the projects to actually move at a faster rate and where you can realize economies of scale, I think is a huge important piece. I would say that that the investments in rail are pretty exciting. Not just the Amtrak piece, but one of the things that I'd always hoped we could do is to extend the Northeast Corridor into the South, down towards Atlanta. And I think there may be resources under this bill that allows us to start to expand rail segments. When you start talking rail in this country, it gets very parochial very quickly because the Northeast Corridor has a constituency that's very strong, very powerful, but the rest of the country doesn't have the kind of rail service the Northeast Corridor does. So I think it's very important to see us expand it, not only improve the Northeast Corridor, but to see it expanded. I think the broadband piece cannot be underscored. If we've learned nothing else during this COVID period of time, the importance of digital access is critical, and seeing that access extended into rural America, I think, is very important. So those are a few things that I think are really critical. But I would say, going back to equity for 1 second, the president proposed $15 billion. The Senate compromises $1 billion. Still a lot of money, but my hope is that they can work through policy to ensure that that is a consideration in all of the dollars that are spent. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, minority and underserved communities win every battle. It just means that we're balancing the equities as we distribute these dollars going forward, because the same process that we had back in 1950 is very much still in place today.
Can you explain that a little bit more in case some people watching don't know what it was exactly that started at 15 billion and ended up at 1 billion?
Well, the negotiator, the president proposed $15 billion, and the Senate negotiators, as they were trying to hash out the various compromises, reduced that number down to 1. And that's more, that's $1 billion more than we've ever had in an equity program for transportation. But when you match it against the trillions of dollars that have been spent over the decades, it's undersized in terms of its ability to actually make the kind of impact that I think we want. So again, I think that the rest of the bill could also balance equity if Congress chooses to include equity considerations as part of the criteria that is used for the rest of the spend.
Yeah. And what is that equity money spent on exactly? What
Well,
kind of work?
that's going to be interesting to see. I mean, one could imagine a dedicated discretionary grant program, for example, where communities and states propose repair work to be done on projects that may have impacted communities. So I suspect that that DOT, if this becomes law, DOT will develop a set of criteria and issue RFPs for states to apply for those dollars.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to become law? I mean,
yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic, and I've said this a long time ago, but there are no Democratic or Republican potholes, and transportation, notwithstanding all of the acrimony that exists on other issues, it has largely been a bipartisan area, and I think this bipartisan compromise is an example of it. And it's also one of the things I talk about in the piece is the fact that I don't think the issues around race or equity are partisan. I really want to try to do the best job I can of taking away the view that this stuff is inherently partisan. I know it has become partisan because people have found political advantage in it, but I actually think this is really an issue of ethics and morality for our country.
Yeah. Well, a reasonably bipartisan highway bill passed when you were secretary, isn't that right?
It did. It did. I was very proud of that.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about it. What was that? What was it? 300 billion?
It was 309 billion.
Yeah.
And yeah, we spent 2 years pounding the pavement across this country. I did 2 bus tours. I went to Janesville, Wisconsin, where Paul Ryan was from. I went down to Kentucky and the Brent Spence Bridge, where Mitch McConnell's from. I actually spent a lot of time with members of both parties trying to get to yes on something. And it turned out that Senator Barbara Boxer and Mitch McConnell ended up being our big champions to get that done. So along the way, by the way, part of the bus tour was with then Vice President Biden. So I know he cares about the infrastructure stuff, and that's part of why he's put it up top in his agenda.
Let me return to rail for a second,
Sure.
because I'm kind of interested in this question of high-speed rail.
Yeah.
And I've read a fair amount about, number one, what it would do to travel times. I mean, it's just
Sure.
a radical revolution in travel times, not only between New York and Washington, but maybe between someplace like Chicago and Minneapolis if they built that route. And also about what it would do just to spur economic activity in this country and to change the country's economy in certain ways. Talk a little bit about that from your perspective, and about in a realistic way, how many years away is the United States? We know that China has high-speed rail, Spain has high-speed rail. In Italy, you can get from Rome to Florence in a staggeringly short period of time. How far away are we, do you think, from having something like that?
Well, most of the countries you mentioned have national systems. Like the federal government is actually building these systems, and in our system, it's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes the states are involved, sometimes private sector freight companies are involved. In our case, I think in the near term, we're going to see city pairs be the focus for high-speed rail. So, the one in California, people have talked about ad infinitum, but there's a project that's being planned in Texas that connects Dallas and Houston. There's one in Florida that connects, West Palm Beach up to Orlando. And I think we will see that type of movement happen across the country. Now, the question of interoperability is another one, which is, if they get those, one type of train sets for the Florida line and a different type of train sets for the Texas line and a different one for California, does it all kind of come together at some point? And that's a flaw in the way that we're doing things. We're not in a position right now to do an end-to-end sort of transcontinental high-speed system. That said, I think within the next couple of decades, you're going to see faster train sets, not only in the Northeast corridor, but hopefully down south. We need to electrify the lines that go south of Washington, D.C., one of the last vestiges of the Civil War, perhaps. And I think we need to try to get more areas with high-speed rail and, frankly, with transit, because those two things don't need to be political issues. If we invest in those modes in all parts of the country, then everybody's going to have a stake in their success.
And is the fact that the freight haulers own a lot of those lines, is that a problem?
It is a problem. The freight companies would argue with me, but I think the truth of the matter is when those rail lines were turned over to the private firms, it's been hard. They have an incentive to keep the capacity to themselves, and it's very difficult for either transit systems or for even Amtrak sometimes to get the kind of access they need to make the service levels what they should be. So that is another problem. I know there's active discussion on the Hill about peeling back some of the power that some of these private rail firms have, and I'll be interested to see how that conversation progresses.
You and me both. Okay, let's change gears now. Since this is Democracy Journal and this series is called Talking Democracy, with every guest, I like at the end to talk a little bit about democracy, because our democracy is in pretty beat up shape right now, and we're in a kind of a dangerous place. I don't think I have to elucidate on what I mean. I think everybody here understands. So, Mr. Secretary, what are your thoughts on the state of our democracy? What are you most concerned about right now?
The tribalism that we have in our politics, I think, is pretty toxic, and I understand it. I understand the evolution of it, but we sorely need to figure out how to create alignments of interest between groups that have historically not worked as well together. One of the things I think about a lot, being from North Carolina, is the urban-rural divide, for example. There are urban schools that are underperforming and rural schools that are underperforming. And if you could ever get the rural communities and the urban communities working together to improve education, I think both of their interests would be served better. And there are many things like that I think have to happen on the ground, because politicians typically are responding to the public. They're not oftentimes, unfortunately, as much as we tell ourselves otherwise, they're often not leading the public. And so I think we have to work from the ground up to create the kind of public imagination of unity that is a 21st century version. And that means bringing in groups that have historically not been part of the national conversation. It means figuring out how to find these alignments of interest, and that's something that in my time outside of politics, I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's one of the reasons, frankly, I wrote this piece.
Yeah. If anyone watching has any questions, just type them up, and I'll take a look at them, and I'll pass them along in the time we have remaining, which looks to be about 5 minutes or so. Now, you were mayor, I hope I'm right about this, when the Republicans were running the state and Tillis was the leader of the legislature, and all those cuts were going on and the Moral Monday protests started. Wasn't that right about the time frame?
Yeah.
Right. Well, that must have been quite an experience to go through as a mayor of a major city. And just what do you think we learn? Well, just describe your experience of what was happening in your state at that time, and what do you think we learn from that with respect to, protecting democracy?
Well, I think one of the things is, the whole Moral Monday movement, I think, kind of got off the ground because of the bathroom bill
Yeah.
that was passed in North Carolina, which happened after I left, by the way. And you know, I think the hard part is that as long as there is a constituency for division, that's what politicians are going to do. And that's why we as American people have to figure out how to convey the message through our own activism, that we don't want to be divided, and that's hard to do because I think in that case there were people whose lives were affected on both sides of that issue, in terms of their view of how the state should work. But at the end of the day, the reality is that we have to live together. One of the things I've always believed is you don't get into a fight in a rowboat, because both of you are going to get wet, and that's what I think we are in a lot of today, are these fights that are over things that perhaps agreement is maybe beyond possible, but there are many things on which we do agree, and we choose to ignore those things that we agree on, to focus in on the disagreement. So I just think the public has a huge responsibility here. And those of us who've been in public office who are no longer have an opportunity perhaps to help the public get there. So I don't know if that's a coherent answer to your question, but I think it's the best answer that can be given right now. I'm sure political scientists are tangled up over this stuff too.
Yeah, they are. So are journalists. Um, yeah, do you have any thoughts about getting back into politics?
No, not at present. I have two high schoolers, and they've just rediscovered my first name, and so I'm enjoying spending time with them, and frankly finding things to do out in my private life that I enjoy. So and frankly, this is a period of time of great tumult and change. And I think we've got younger people out there that have new ideas and lots of energy. And I'm interested in helping to cultivate another generation of leaders to maybe take the reins and lead us forward.
So, with respect to the future of transportation, what do you tell people? What are the three most important things that this country needs to do?
Well, we need to invest, and we've started with the conversation that's happening in Washington. I think it's a big deal. And by the way, at the local level, look at Austin, Texas, which put $5 billion into building their transportation system. Seattle has done similar work. Los Angeles has done it. A lot of communities are taking it on their own, but I think the investment is critical. Second thing is we've got to know where we're going, and that's part of the idea of the planning commission concept. But it's also our policies have to be triggered towards where we're headed, not where we were. And there's so many conversations about, well, we just need to get the highway, trust fund plussed up and this and that. And the truth of the matter is we can never go back to 1955. And frankly, for my money, I don't want to. I want 2021, 2022, 23. I want these to be better years than they ever could have been in 1955. So I think having a future-minded set of policies that we follow would be critical. And that extends to climate, extends to equity, extends to mobility, all those things. And then third, I actually think that we should empower more of our local communities to have a voice in how the transportation system unfolds. And that's rural and urban areas, because they have unique needs that sometimes are not met by the way that the system works today. So I'd put them in the driver's seat a little bit and give them direct federal dollars so that they can help us shape the future in the best possible way.
The essay is called "It's Time for Transportation Equity" by Secretary Anthony Foxx. That's with two X's if you Google it. please do come to www.democracyjournal.org and check it out. Check out our other articles too, like our special project on the US Constitution that we posted this summer. I think you'll find that very interesting. I want to thank everybody who joined in to watch today, and especially I want to thank Secretary Foxx for being a guest on Talking Democracy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Everyone have a nice afternoon.